Tonight, we are looking at major questions about this operation. Its efficacy, whether the president's claims are true, and that should be learned over time. Its long-term planning, what comes next, if indeed we've already taken out the leader of Iran, and what the responses will be. Are there unintended consequences for a region that has many, many opponents and enemies of the Iranian?
The story you are being given by the mainstream press is a story about procedure, about congressional notification, about whether a president followed the correct administrative steps before committing American forces to combat. That is the story they are telling. Here is the story they are not telling. Iran was holding 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog, the day before the strikes began. At that purity, 60%, a short technical step from weapons grade, that stockpile was sufficient by the International Atomic Energy Agency's own mathematics for 10 nuclear weapons. And the American Defense Intelligence Agency had assessed in May of 2025 that Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one of those weapons in, quote, probably less than 1 week, not 1 year, not 1 month. If the standard for imminent threat is defined to require an assembled nuclear weapon already pointed at an American city, then the doctrine of pre-emption has been permanently retired, and the only nations that benefit from its retirement are the ones racing to build the weapons that would have triggered it. I am John Gray. Let us follow the logic. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a joint military campaign targeting Iranian military installations, nuclear remnants, missile production infrastructure, and senior leadership. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes. Iran launched retaliatory attacks on American military bases across the Gulf, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supply transits, was closed. The mainstream press led with a single constitutional question. Did the president have the authority to act without Congress? That is a real question, and we will answer it. But it is not the first question. It is not the most important question. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution reads, "The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States." That provision has been interpreted consistently by administrations of both parties. In Reagan's Libya strikes in 1986, in Clinton's Kosovo campaign in 1999, in Obama's Libya intervention in 2011, as vesting the executive with inherent authority to deploy military force when the threat is imminent, when the situation demands rapid response, or when diplomatic avenues have been exhausted. The Lower Powers Resolution of 1973, the statute critics are citing, requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of committing forces to hostilities, and to seek authorization within 60 days. It was passed over President Nixon's veto. It has been partially defied by every president since. Its constitutionality has never been definitively ruled on by the Supreme Court. It is a contested statutory limit on a constitutional power. The administration briefed the bipartisan leadership group, known as the Gang of Eight, before the strikes commenced. Secretary of State Rubio consulted 7 of the 8 members. That is the procedural record. But here is what the procedural debate conceals. Let me take you inside a mountain 60 miles south of Tehran. The Fordow Fuel Enrichment Plant. The Fordow Fuel Enrichment Plant is buried 80 to 90 meters underground, 260 to 300 feet, inside a mountain near the city of Qom. Iran acknowledged to the International Atomic Energy Agency in October of 2009 that it built Fordow underground specifically because of, and I am quoting Iran's own letter to the agency, threats of military attacks against Iran. Israel's most advanced bunker-busting weapons cannot reach its centrifuge halls. Neither can any weapon in France's arsenal, or Germany's, or the United Kingdom's. Only one nation on Earth possesses the weapon capable of penetrating to Fordow's operating depth: the United States. Only one aircraft can carry that weapon: the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The weapon is the GBU-57, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, 30,000 pounds. The United States military spent $400 million developing it. Its designers spent 15 years studying Fordow specifically. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said this about Fordow at the Pentagon in June of 2025. You do not build a multi-layered underground bunker complex with centrifuges and other equipment in a mountain for any peaceful purpose. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, citing the facility's own physical design as evidence of intent. Iran did not build a facility that only one nation on Earth could destroy because it was enriching uranium for a civilian power program. That is not an assertion. That is the physical evidence. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was designed around a single critical threshold. The Obama administration insisted that Iran's nuclear constraints must be set such that its breakout time, the time required to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one bomb, remained at a minimum of 12 months. 12 months was considered the minimum time necessary to give diplomacy a functioning margin. That was the standard. 12 months. Here is what happened. When the United States withdrew from the deal in 2018, Iran began systematically dismantling every constraint that had maintained that margin. By 2019, breakout time had shrunk to 6 to 8 months. By 2022, it had collapsed to approximately 10 days. By May of 2025, the United States Defense Intelligence Agency assessed it at probably less than 1 week. 12 months to 1 week, while 3 separate rounds of diplomatic negotiations were underway. The critics who say diplomacy was working watched that timeline shrink from 12 months to under 7 days and concluded the trend was benign. Iran's pre-strike stockpile of 60% enriched uranium stood at 440.9 kilograms, confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency in February of 2026. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement the mainstream press says Iran had committed to, capped Iran's total enriched uranium at 202 kilograms of material enriched to 3.67%. Iran was holding enriched uranium more than 40 times over that limit, and enriched to a purity 16 times higher than the treaty permitted. The International Atomic Energy Agency stated this explicitly. Iran is, and I quote, the only non-nuclear weapon state in the world producing uranium at 60% purity. No civilian nuclear program on Earth requires 60% enriched uranium. Power reactors operate on uranium enriched to less than 5%. Research reactors use 20%. 60% has one practical application. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Director General confirmed in February of 2026 that Iran's stockpile was, quote, still there, in large quantities, despite the June 2025 strikes. It was not going away. It was being rebuilt. On June 12, 2025, 8 months before Operation Epic Fury, the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors formally found Iran non-compliant with its obligations under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the treaty that underpins the international nuclear order. The first such finding in 20 years. Iran is a signatory to the NPT. Articles 1 and 2 of that treaty bind non-nuclear states to forego weapons programs and to submit to International Atomic Energy Agency verification. Iran signed that treaty. Iran violated it, formally, officially, by vote of the United Nations' own nuclear oversight body. Iran's response was not to negotiate. Iran announced it would launch a new enrichment site and install additional advanced centrifuges. Iran formally ended the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in October of 2025. Iran expelled International Atomic Energy Agency cooperation entirely, and satellite images from late January of 2026 showed active construction at the bombed nuclear sites, indicating either repair or relocation of enriched uranium. Every time diplomacy engaged, Iran enriched. Every time talks resumed, the stockpile grew. Every time a breakthrough was announced, the breakout timeline was shorter than it had been the month before. The mainstream press, the New York Times, NPR, CNN, and the Associated Press led their coverage of Operation Epic Fury with a single frame. Trump launches surprise attack on Iran without congressional approval. That frame is not false. The president did not seek a congressional declaration of war. But here is the logic bridge test. What did the mainstream press choose to omit from that frame? It omitted that the International Atomic Energy Agency had formally declared Iran non-compliant with the Non-Proliferation Treaty 8 months earlier. It omitted that the agency's own Director General had warned Iran's stockpile could fuel 10 nuclear weapons. It omitted that the Defense Intelligence Agency had assessed Iran's breakout time at under 1 week. It omitted that Iran's 60% enriched uranium stockpile had no civilian justification. It omitted that Iran had expelled International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, formally ended the nuclear deal, and was actively rebuilding bombed nuclear sites. And it omitted the sentence from the International Atomic Energy Agency that the whole case rests on. Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state in the world enriching uranium to 60% purity. That sentence makes the case for action rather than against it. Now, let me give the critics their strongest argument. Their strongest argument, in their own words, presented accurately. The Stimson Center, a respected American think tank, published this assessment within hours of the strikes on February 28th. The Stimson Center argues that Operation Epic Fury is unconstitutional, unwise, and a betrayal of the president's commitment to American interests. They argue it is a premeditated, preventive war, not a defensive action to address an imminent threat. They argue that air power alone cannot produce regime change. And in earlier analysis, they noted that Iran had, quote, repeatedly promised not to make nuclear weapons, and that a religious ruling by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei forbids production of weapons of mass destruction. That is their position, presented accurately, no caricature. Here is the position Logic Bridge holds. The International Atomic Energy Agency, not the Trump administration, not an Israeli intelligence brief, the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog, confirmed Iran was enriching to 60%, accumulating nearly 450 kilograms of it, had expelled International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, severed cooperation with the agency, and formally ended its treaty obligations in October of 2025. The Defense Intelligence Agency assessed breakout time at under 1 week. Fordow was built in secret, inside a mountain, for the explicitly stated purpose of surviving military strikes. A religious fatwa from a regime that funds Hezbollah, arms the Houthis, and directed the killing of American service members across the Middle East is not a nuclear non-proliferation agreement. It is an assertion. Which of these two evidentiary standards, a United Nations agency's documented findings or a religious ruling from a deceased supreme leader, should govern the security of 235 million Americans? I will let you draw your own conclusion. On February 27th, 2026, 1 day before the strikes, Oman's foreign minister announced a diplomatic breakthrough. He said Iran had agreed in principle to never stockpile enriched uranium, and to submit to full International Atomic Energy Agency verification. The mainstream press cited this as proof that diplomacy had been working and was destroyed by the strikes. Let me bring this home. Iran had never signed that agreement. Iran had increased its 60% stockpile by nearly 50% between February and May of 2025, while negotiations were active. Iran had formally ended the nuclear deal in October of 2025, while diplomacy was described as ongoing. Satellite images from late January of 2026 showed construction at bombed nuclear sites, while the Oman talks were in their third round. The Oman breakthrough was a verbal commitment, never written, never signed, from the same regime that had systematically violated every written commitment it had made since 2019. The administration's special envoy reported to the president directly, Iran was not serious about a nuclear deal. That is not an assertion. That is the contemporaneous account of the American negotiator who was in the room. Let me bring this home. The procedural argument against Operation Epic Fury is not wrong. The Constitution assigns the power to declare war to Congress. That is Article 1, Section 8. It is real, it matters, and the debate over where the Commander-in-Chief's authority ends and Congress's begins is a legitimate constitutional debate, one this country has been having since Vietnam. But here is what that debate cannot do. It cannot substitute the timeline of congressional deliberation for the timeline of nuclear proliferation. The congressional debate that critics demand would have taken months. Iran's breakout window was days. If the standard for imminent threat is permanently elevated, if imminent is redefined to mean already assembled and aimed, then the doctrine of pre-emption has been retired in the one domain where its retirement costs the most, because a nuclear weapon cannot be undetonated. A proliferation event cannot be diplomatically reversed after the fact. The verification regime the International Atomic Energy Agency was meant to provide had already been destroyed by Iran. The treaty Iran had signed had already been ended by Iran. The inspectors whose job was to detect breakout had already been expelled. What remained, the morning of February 28, 2026, was a regime holding 10 nuclear weapons worth of fissile material in a mountain-buried facility built to survive the very strikes that had already been attempted, with a proven capability to reach weapons grade in under 7 days, and a 7-year documented record of using every diplomatic engagement as cover for continued enrichment acceleration. That was the intelligence picture. That was the documented record. And here is the principle those facts demand we defend. National sovereignty, the ability of the United States to define and protect its own security interests, requires that American deterrence remain credible. Deterrence without the capacity to act is not deterrence. It is a promise that cannot be kept. If Operation Epic Fury is condemned as unconstitutional, if the legal and moral case for acting against a documented nuclear threshold state is successfully dismantled, then North Korea's strategy has been validated as the global template. Every regime that wants a nuclear weapon now has a roadmap. Enrich to 60%. Expel the inspectors. Enter negotiations. Watch the clock run out. And wait for the international community to accept the new reality. The Constitution was written to provide for the common defense. It was not written as a guarantee that America would always be second.